I spent $20,000 on a dream family vacation, and at the airport, my own son told me, "Dad, I forgot your ticket. Just go home." That was the moment my life turned from love into betrayal. My name is Henry Caldwell, and this is not just a vacation story. This is a family betrayal story, a toxic family story, the kind of inheritance drama that people whisper about but never expect to happen to them. I wanted a week in paradise with the people I love most. What I got instead was a lesson in cruelty, a front row seat to how easily kindness can be mistaken for weakness. For months I had imagined the turquoise waters of Hawaii, the scent of plumeria drifting through warm island air, my grandchildren laughing as waves rolled over their ankles. I could see it all the sunrise over Waikiki dinners by the beach, a family united around shared memories. I thought this vacation would heal the cracks. Instead, it shattered everything. At the San Francisco airport suitcase rolling behind me, I heard my son Daniel's voice slice through the crowd. "Dad, I forgot to buy your ticket." The words didn't feel real. They floated in the air, almost absurd, while families around me laughed, checked in, hugged, and prepared for paradise. I asked him again, my chest tight, my voice barely steady, and he repeated it, cold, flat, final. "Just go home." That's the moment I understood what it means to be discarded. You are not just left behind, you are erased, stripped of dignity in a public place, forced to stand among strangers, while your own flesh and blood treats you like excess baggage. The crowd didn't notice, but I did. The betrayal was so clean it almost felt rehearsed. I had spent 3 months planning. I had wired $20,000 into Daniel's account so he could coordinate everything. Hotels, flights, rental cars, excursions for the kids, I funded it all. I thought generosity meant closeness. What it really bought me was silence, exclusion, and humiliation. That day at the terminal was my first taste of what the algorithm calls a revenge story, the kind of karma story where betrayal plants a seed that grows into justice. I didn't know yet how far this would go. I didn't know I would one day stand in the same airport with a lawyer beside me and documents that would rip Daniel's greed apart. But as I stared at the departure board flashing "final boarding call," without my name on it, I felt something shift inside me. This is not just my vacation gone wrong. This is the moment a father discovered his family's mask, the instant a lifetime of giving turned into a demand for justice. This is where the story of betrayal begins. I remember standing at the counter, my hands resting on the cool metal edge, the rolling suitcase tipped over at my feet like a wounded animal. The woman behind the computer wore the kind of polite smile that airlines train into their employees, but I could see the flicker of discomfort in her eyes as she typed my name again and again. "Sir," she said carefully, "I'm not finding any reservation under Henry Caldwell." "Are you sure it was booked with Hawaiian Airlines?" My throat tightened. It had to be there. My son promised me everything was handled. I leaned closer, lowering my voice, so the strangers around us wouldn't hear the desperation. "Check again, please. My family should already be on this flight." She typed faster this time, her glasses catching the glow of the monitor. The seconds stretched like hours. Finally, she looked up, her smile gone. "I do see a reservation," she said slowly, "for Daniel Caldwell. Party of 4, 2 adults, 2 children. Booked 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks ago." The words hit me harder than Daniel's earlier dismissal. 6 weeks ago meant it was never a mistake. It was never about a forgotten ticket. It was a decision, a deliberate choice to carve me out of my own family's future. This wasn't an accident. This was a betrayal. I turned toward Daniel, who was pretending to scroll on his phone near the security line. He didn't even flinch when our eyes met. No guilt, no shame. Only relief, like someone watching a storm cloud finally move out to sea. That look told me everything he had planned, this rehearsed. It maybe even savored the moment he could finally say the words, "Just go home." The agent asked softly if I wanted to see what else was available, but her voice was far away now. My mind was replaying every dinner at Clara's house, every conversation where my family had smiled at me, praised me for my generosity, clinked glasses to the idea of Hawaii sunsets. They had toasted me while secretly plotting to erase me. I thought about the calendar in my study back home. 3 months of notes scribbled in my careful handwriting, snorkeling tours, sunset luau's, a day trip to the volcano. Daniel had sat at my kitchen table and nodded at each suggestion, reassuring me that he would take care of the logistics. Dad, don't worry. You've done enough. Just relax and enjoy yourself. Now I realize those words weren't kindness. They were a smokescreen. The vacation had never included me. Around me, families shuffled past with boarding passes in hand, their children tugging on stuffed animals, their spouses chatting excitedly about hotel pools and luau's. Each laugh, each cheerful call for a boarding group felt like a blade cutting into me. I was supposed to be one of them, a grandfather leading his family into an adventure. Instead, I was standing there like a fool, a man funding memories he would never share. I stepped back from the counter, my suitcase handle trembling in my grip. Daniel approached just close enough to speak, his tone clipped and impatient. Dad, it's over. The flight's boarding. Just go home. He didn't even lower his voice. Passengers glanced our way, curious, some pitying. My face burned. That was the moment the mask fell. It wasn't about a ticket. It was about control. Daniel didn't want me in Hawaii because I was never part of his vision of family. He wanted my money, not my presence. To him, I wasn't a father anymore. I was a bank account with a name attached, and today that name had been deleted. I tried to steady my breathing, but my chest felt hollow. Eleanor's words echoed in my head. Kindness is not weakness. Yet here I was, standing in an airport surrounded by strangers, realizing my own kindness had been weaponized against me. This was family betrayal in its purest form. For a brief second, I wondered if Clara had orchestrated it too. She was always polite, always quick with a compliment. But compliments can be daggers when you see them in hindsight. Maybe it was easier for them to laugh at me behind closed doors to imagine how gullible I must have looked, scribbling plans in my notebook, trusting every word. The boarding call blared over the loudspeaker, final call for Flight 447 to Honolulu. The red letters on the departure board flashed like a cruel countdown. My family's names were on that list. Mine wasn't. They were walking into paradise. I was being shoved into irrelevance. 6 weeks ago, Daniel had drawn a line. He didn't want a father. He wanted a wallet. And now the truth was standing in front of me in black and white, printed across a screen that refused to recognize my name. I picked up my suitcase, the wheels clattering across the tile, each step heavier than the last. I wasn't just leaving the terminal. I was leaving the illusion that this family had ever wanted me there. And in that bitter silence, with the hum of the air conditioning above and the laughter of vacationers all around, a seed began to take root. A seed called justice. A seed called revenge. Because one thing was suddenly very clear: family betrayal always comes with a price. Looking back, the signs had been there all along, hidden beneath layers of smiles and scripted words. At the time, I wanted to believe them. I wanted to believe that my family's warmth was real, that the laughter at the dinner table and the endless compliments were born from love, not calculation. But once you've been betrayed, you start replaying every moment with new eyes, and what once felt comforting begins to reek of manipulation. The truth is, they had been rehearsing this betrayal for months, maybe even longer. I remember the night we first sat down to plan the trip. Clara brought out wine glasses, filled them generously, and toasted to me like I was some kind of hero. Henry, you're the glue that holds this family together, she said, her smile perfectly symmetrical, her voice dripping with admiration. Daniel nodded and added, Dad, you've always put us first. This trip will finally give us a chance to give something back to you. At the time, I believed him. I wanted to believe him. I raised my glass, clinked it against theirs, and felt warmth spread through my chest. But now I see it for what it was, not gratitude, not love, just a performance designed to soften me before the ask. Pearl, my sister Helen's daughter, sat across from me, her husband Robert, quiet as always, his hands folded neatly on the table. Helen kept repeating how generous I was, how lucky the grandchildren were to have a grandfather willing to spend so much. It sounded sincere then, but now I realize it was more like a chorus, each voice repeating the same lines in harmony, a script written in advance. They weren't praising me. They were conditioning me. I remember Lily tugging at my sleeve, her little voice, asking if we could swim with dolphins. James chimed in about wanting to build the biggest sandcastle on the beach. Their innocence made me feel like the money was worth it, that I was buying not just a trip, but the kind of memories children carry for a lifetime. But what I didn't see then was the way Daniel watched me as his kid spoke, his eyes sharp, almost calculating like a salesman closing a deal. Every dinner after that seemed to circle back to the vacation. Clara would casually mention how stressful it was to book hotels during peak season, how difficult it would be to coordinate everyone's schedules. Helen would sigh and say, "We're just so grateful you're handling everything, Henry. Really, we couldn't do this without you." Their words felt sweet at the time. Now they taste like poison. They weren't relieving me of responsibility. They were stripping me of agency. They wanted me to feel important while quietly making sure I was blind. One evening I remember Daniel leaning back in his chair after dessert, swirling the last of his wine. "Daddy said you've always been the one to sacrifice for us. Let us take care of the details this time. You've done more than enough." At that moment I thought I was being cared for. Now I understand that was the moment he seized control. By convincing me to step aside, he ensured I wouldn't see the fine print, the names on the reservations, the glaring omission of mine. It was never about honoring me, it was about silencing me. The worst part of hindsight is realizing how eagerly I believed them. I remember pulling out brochures circling activities for the grandchildren, excitedly suggesting luau's and snorkeling tours. Clara smiled politely, Daniel nodded, Helen hummed in agreement. Yet whenever I pushed for specifics, dates, times, confirmations, Daniel would wave me off. "Relax, Dad. I'll take care of it. You've done enough." That phrase, "you've done enough," haunts me now. It wasn't reassurance, it was dismissal. It was the sound of a door closing quietly but firmly. Even small comments sting when replayed in the light of betrayal. Clara once said, "Maybe you'd be more comfortable in a different hotel, Dad. You know, somewhere quieter away from the kids." At the time, I thought she was being considerate. Now I see it, she was planting the idea of separation, preparing me for exclusion. Every compliment, every suggestion of rest was a brick in the wall they were building to push me out. And I remember their smiles when I transferred the money. $20,000 wired into Daniel's account, the culmination of months of subtle nudges and orchestrated affection. Clara kissed my cheek, Daniel hugged me firmly. Helen called me the most generous man alive. I basked in it then. Now when I recall those gestures, I feel sick. They weren't thanking me. They were congratulating themselves. That's the cruelest part of family betrayal. You don't realize you're in the play until after the curtain falls. What you thought was love turns out to be lines read from a script each performance perfected to keep you blind. The warmth of those dinners now feels like the heat of a spotlight illuminating my role as the fool in their drama. I used to believe my family's affection was unshakable, but standing at that airport counter, hearing the truth about the tickets booked 6 weeks earlier, I realized those smiles had never been for me. They had been for the money, and the applause I thought I heard was really the sound of a trap snapping shut. Toxic family doesn't announce itself. It charms you, flatters you, and convinces you that you're indispensable right up until the moment you realize you've been erased. And that realization cut deeper than any blade. After the shock at the airport and the sickening realization that the smiles at the dinner table had all been fake, I found myself driving back through Oakland with a kind of hollow silence pressing against my chest. The freeways were busy commuters, honking kids in back seats, arguing over fast food bags. Life was moving forward for everyone else. But for me, time had stalled somewhere between disbelief and rage. When I pulled into my driveway, the house looked exactly the same as it had that morning, neat lawn porch, light automatic curtains drawn. But nothing inside me felt the same. I unlocked the door and suddenly the quiet of my home didn't comfort me. It accused me. I stood in the foyer, suitcase still in my hand, and felt Eleanor's absence more than ever. She had been gone for 3 years, yet in that moment her presence was everywhere. Her handwriting on the recipe card taped to the fridge. Her favorite cardigan still folded neatly in the hallway closet. The faint scent of lavender from the drawer where she kept her scarves. I sat down heavily in her chair by the window, staring at the framed photograph on the mantel. Eleanor in her nursing uniform, smiling at me, the way only she ever could, as if she knew every flaw I had and loved me anyway. It was her voice that came back to me then, as clear as if she were sitting beside me. Kindness is not weakness. Don't ever let them confuse the two. She had said that dozens of times throughout our marriage, usually after standing up to a doctor who had dismissed her or after refusing to let a friend take advantage of her generosity. I admired her strength, but I never realized how much I would need those words myself. Now, sitting alone in that house, I understood that what had happened at the airport wasn't just cruelty, it was the result of me mistaking kindness for obligation. I replayed every moment of the past few months, each false compliment, each "Dad, don't worry, you've done enough," and I realized how thoroughly I had been played. The betrayal wasn't sudden. It had been a slow erosion masked as affection. Eleanor would have seen through it. She always did. She had warned me in her way, but I had ignored it, clinging to the belief that family could never be toxic, that love would always be enough. But family betrayal doesn't announce itself with fireworks. It creeps in like rot, and by the time you smell it, the foundation is already cracked. I leaned back in her chair, closing my eyes, and let the grief wash over me. It wasn't just grief for Eleanor, though. It was grief for the man I had allowed myself to become, a provider, without boundaries, a father too eager to be loved, a man who confused his bank account for his worth. I had thought I was buying memories for my grandchildren. Instead, I had paid for my own erasure. That truth burned, but beneath the burn, there was something harder, sharper. Eleanor's words refused to let me collapse. Kindness is not weakness. If that was true, then I had a choice. I could let Daniel's betrayal define me as a fool, or I could use the pain to carve out a new path, one where kindness was backed by strength, one where generosity came with boundaries. I stood up and walked into my study, flicking on the light. The room was a shrine to order oak desk polished filing cabinets, aligned drawers neatly labeled in Eleanor's hand. On the second shelf sat a folder labeled Hawaii 2025. I pulled it down, spread the contents across the desk, and stared at the receipts. There it was in black and white, $20,000 wired to Daniel's account, hotel reservations under the names of everyone, including Eleanor, who had been dead for 3 years, but not mine. That single detail felt like a dagger. They hadn't even bothered to hide their cruelty. They erased me so completely, they resurrected the dead before they included me. I pressed my palms against the desk, the cool leather grounding me. My chest no longer felt hollow. It felt heavy, yes, but heavy with purpose. Betrayal had lit a fire where grief once lived. Eleanor had fought her battles with courage. Now it was my turn. This wasn't going to be just another sad story of a man forgotten by his family. This was going to be a revenge story, a karma story, one where justice would be served not through shouting or violence, but through something sharper, clarity, law, and the one resource Daniel thought he controlled: money. I knew Eleanor would approve. She had built her life on compassion, but she had never let anyone mistake that compassion for fragility. And if kindness was not weakness, then betrayal was not victory. It was only the beginning of accountability. That night, as the house settled into silence, I sat at Eleanor's desk, pen in hand, notebook open, and began writing. Not just notes, not just receipts, but a plan. Every line I wrote was a step away from grief and a step toward justice. And as I wrote, I whispered her words aloud, letting them anchor me. Kindness is not weakness, and betrayal has a price. The house was dark when I returned, but my mind was wide awake, sharper than it had been in years. I flicked on the lights in my study, the room Eleanor had once called the command center, and sat at the oak desk she used to polish every spring. Spread before me were the documents from the folder labeled Hawaii 2025. At first, they had been a source of pride, proof that I was still the man who could give his family joy. Now, under the harsh glare of the desk lamp, they looked like evidence in a case file, each page a record of my own humiliation. But humiliation can become fuel if you let it, and that night I chose to turn my pain into purpose. I began by organizing every receipt, every email confirmation, every wire transfer. There was the $20,000 bank slip showing the exact day Daniel received my money. There was the hotel confirmation listing 7 names: Daniel, Clara, Lily, James, Helen, Robert, and even Eleanor, my wife, who had been gone for 3 years, but not mine. The cruelty of that detail burned hotter than anything else. They had erased me so thoroughly they included the dead instead. I stacked each paper in order, careful, methodical, like an engineer assembling blueprints for something much larger than a vacation. Then I reached for the phone. Not the sleek cell phone Daniel was always glued to, but the old landline Eleanor insisted we keep. I dialed the resort in Hawaii, my voice steady as I gave the reservation number. The woman on the line confirmed everything in a tone sweet enough to belong to a postcard: 10 nights ocean view suites, 7 guests. When she asked if I'd like to cancel, I didn't hesitate. Yes, I said firmly. cancel it all. She warned me about the penalty over $3,000 lost, but I didn't flinch. $3,000 was a small price to pay to take back control. She processed the cancellation, and I imagined Daniel and Clara walking up to the desk in Honolulu, smiling and ready to check in, only to be told they had no rooms. That thought didn't heal me, but it steadied me. My phone lit up almost immediately after. At first it was texts. "Dad, this isn't funny. Call us back. Urgent." Then came the calls. Over and over the same Hawaii number ringing through the night like an alarm. I let it ring. Each voicemail grew more desperate, shifting from pleading to angry. "Dad, the kids are crying. You ruined everything." Then harsher, "Fix this now or you'll regret it." I played them twice then, 3 times, and finally picked up a pen. I wrote the exact words down in a notebook, carefully noting the times. By morning, I had a log filled with Daniel's threats and admissions. If he wanted a war of words, I would make sure every word became evidence. Somewhere between midnight and dawn, as the phone kept buzzing, I felt something inside me settle. This wasn't just about a vacation anymore. This was about years of being used, covering Daniel's mortgage payments, paying off medical bills for Clara, buying school supplies and sports gear for the grandchildren. Each sacrifice had been accepted without gratitude, without acknowledgement. What happened at the airport was just the final straw the mask ripped away. If Daniel believed I would quietly roll over, he was about to learn that kindness, when betrayed, can turn into resolve. That morning, I pulled out Richard Coleman's business card. He had handled Eleanor's estate when she passed, guiding me through paperwork I could barely read through tears. Richard had been professional but kind, the sort of lawyer who treated people like more than billable hours. I dialed his office and scheduled an urgent consultation. "I need to make changes to my will," I told his assistant. My voice didn't shake. It was the voice of a man who had finally made up his mind. When I arrived at Richard's downtown office the next day, the glass tower gleamed in the morning sun. He greeted me with a firm handshake, eyes sharp behind his glasses. "Henry," he said, "tell me what happened." I laid out the evidence, the receipts, the cancellation, and the log of threats. I didn't embellish. I didn't need to. The story spoke for itself: a son exploiting his father, a pattern of financial dependency stretching back decades, capped by a betrayal so brazen it left no room for doubt. Richard listened, taking notes, nodding occasionally. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair. "Henry, this is classic financial coercion. In California, you have every right to disinherit him and protect your estate." The word disinherit hit me like a thunderclap. For the first time in days, I felt something close to relief. Justice was not just possible, it was already within reach. Richard explained how we could structure the will so that Daniel would have no grounds to contest it, how we would document everything to prove my mental competence. The plan was clean, legal, unshakable. And as he spoke, I felt Eleanor's voice echo in my heart again. Kindness is not weakness. She had been right all along. When I left the office, portfolio of documents in hand, I walked out into the busy streets of San Francisco with a strange calm. The betrayal had wounded me, yes, but it had also awakened me. My family thought they had written the final chapter of my story at that airport, but what they didn't know was that I had just picked up the pen. This was no longer about loss. This was about justice served. This was about showing them that family betrayal always comes with a price. 2 weeks later, I stood once again in the arrivals hall of San Francisco International Airport, but this time I was not the abandoned old man dragging a suitcase in confusion. I was there with Richard Coleman at my side, his leather portfolio tucked neatly under his arm, and a calmness in my chest I hadn't felt in years. The overhead monitors flashed the incoming flights, and there it was, Honolulu to San Francisco on time. My heart thudded, once heavy but steady. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment the truth would no longer be whispered in notebooks or sealed in manila envelopes. This was the moment betrayal would meet consequence. Travelers streamed through customs, tanned families with plastic leis still around their necks, couples lugging duty-free bags, business travelers glued to their phones. Then I saw them. First came Helen chatting animatedly to Robert, a shopping bag swinging from her wrist. Then Clara appeared clutching Lily's hand, James trailing behind with a stuffed dolphin under his arm. They looked tired but cheerful, carrying the glow of paradise back into California air. And finally, Daniel emerged, his Hawaiian shirt rumpled, his face buried in his phone, walking with the swagger of a man convinced his problems were behind him. Lily spotted me first. Her eyes lit up, and she broke free from Clara's hand. "Grandpa!" She shouted, her little ukulele bouncing against her hip as she ran into my arms. James followed close behind, his smile wide and genuine. Their hugs nearly undid me, the kind of pure love only grandchildren can give. For a moment, the bitterness faded, replaced by the warmth of innocence. But then I looked up and saw Daniel's expression freeze. He stopped mid-stride, confusion hardening into dread, as his gaze shifted from me to Richard, standing beside me. "Dad," Daniel said slowly, his voice carrying a note of warning, "what are you doing here?" I straightened gently, placing Lily and James at my side. "Welcoming you home," I replied, my tone calm, but sharp enough to cut. "How was your vacation?" Clara stepped forward, her smile tight, eyes flicking nervously toward Richard. "Henry, what a surprise," she began, her voice honeyed but brittle. "I'm sure we can talk about whatever this is later in private." "No," Richard said firmly, stepping forward with the authority of a judge. He extended the sealed envelope toward Daniel. "Mr. Daniel Caldwell, this is a copy of your father's revised last will and testament executed on May 25th, 2025. The air seemed to thicken. Daniel's hands trembled as he took the envelope, his vacation tan paling under the harsh airport lights. He tore it open with jerky movements, scanning the pages. I watched the change on his face, the confusion, the disbelief, and finally the horror as the words carved into him deeper than any blade. He was disinherited, entirely, permanently. "This can't be real," he muttered, his voice cracking. Clara leaned over his shoulder, her own face draining of color as she read. Helen stopped talking mid-sentence, her chatter silenced by the weight of the document. Robert's accountant's eyes understood immediately. Numbers and consequences never lied. Henry, Clara pleaded, shifting tactics, her voice low and urgent. "Surely we can work this out. Think about the children. They're your grandchildren." I met her gaze without flinching. I did think about them. That's why I paid $20,000 for their Hawaiian vacation. Daniel's head snapped up, fury blazing. "You can't do this to us." "I'm your son." "Yes," I said evenly, "the son who left me stranded at an airport and threatened me when I refused to clean up your mess." Travelers were slowing down now, sensing drama. Some pretended not to stare, others openly watched, their curiosity drawn to the sound of a family unraveling in public. The same place I had once been humiliated now became the stage where the tables turned. "This is impossible," Daniel barked, voice rising. "You can't disinherit family. There are laws." Richard adjusted his glasses, in his voice calm and clinical. "Actually, Mr. Caldwell, California probate law fully supports your father's right to distribute his estate as he chooses. The documentation is legally ironclad. Any challenge will fail." Daniel's face twisted, desperation spilling into rage. "I'll take you to court. I'll prove you were manipulated, that you're not thinking clearly." Richard handed him a card with practiced precision. "We've already prepared video documentation of your father's competency. Any attorney you hire will advise you against frivolous litigation." Daniel crumpled the will in his fist, then smoothed it out again as if that might change the words. But nothing could erase them. Not this time. Pearl, finally sensing the gravity, whispered, "Lee, what's happening?" "Why does everyone look so upset?" Robert gently guided her back, murmuring that maybe they should give us space. But space wasn't what Daniel wanted. He wanted control. He wanted the narrative back in his hands. "You'll regret this," he spat, his voice loud enough to draw stares. "You'll regret this, old man." I felt Lily squeeze my hand, her small fingers grounding me. I looked at Daniel. Really looked at him, the son I had raised, the man who had become a stranger. And I said clearly, so everyone could hear, "No, Daniel. The only thing I regret is letting you mistake my kindness for weakness. Betrayal always has a price. Today you're paying it." The crowd buzzed. Richard closed his portfolio and I turned toward the exit. Behind me, Daniel's voice rose again, angry, desperate, bargaining. But it no longer mattered. For the first time in years, I felt the weight lift from my shoulders. At the same airport where my humiliation began, justice had finally been served. As I walked toward the sliding doors of the terminal with Richard at my side, I could still hear Daniel's voice echoing behind me, sharp and frantic, clinging to whatever scraps of control he thought he had left. But the echo wasn't power anymore. It was desperation. The will in his trembling hands wasn't just a legal document. It was a mirror forcing him to see what he had become. A son stripped of inheritance, stripped of credibility, stripped of the illusion that betrayal carried no cost. The looks on the rest of the family's faces were carved into my memory. Clara's lips parted in disbelief, her eyes darting between me and the papers, already calculating what this meant for the mortgage, the credit cards, the lifestyle she had built on my quiet support. Helen, usually so talkative, stood frozen, her chatter silenced at last by the weight of truth. Robert's jaw tightened. As an accountant, he didn't need words to understand that numbers never lie, especially the kind that vanish in a single stroke of a pen. And then there were Lily and James clutching my hands, their small faces confused but trusting. They didn't understand the drama, but they understood love, and that was enough. Daniel tried to follow his voice, rising louder with every step I took away. You can't do this. You can't just erase me. People in the terminal stopped pretending not to listen. Phones lifted discreetly, cameras recording the meltdown of a man who had gambled everything on greed and lost. Clara tugged at his sleeve, whispering for him to calm down, but he shook her off. He didn't want calm, he wanted control. But control had slipped through his fingers the moment I signed my name on that new will. I turned once more before stepping outside, fixing my eyes on him. Daniel, I said, my voice steady enough to cut through the chaos. This isn't me erasing you. This is you erasing yourself. Betrayal always has a price, and today you learned what it costs. For a heartbeat, silence hung heavy between us. His face twisted, part rage, part disbelief, part shame. The crowd murmured. Richard checked his watch, and I turned away for the last time. Outside, the California air felt fresher than it had in months. I wasn't the old man abandoned at the departure gate anymore. I was a man who had reclaimed his dignity. In the days that followed, the fallout spread quickly. Clara left voicemails filled with apologies and excuses, her voice trembling as she tried to frame it all as a misunderstanding. Henry, you know Daniel didn't mean to. He was just stressed. Think of the children. But I didn't call back. I didn't need to. The children were innocent, yes, but protecting them didn't mean enabling the toxic cycle their parents had built. Family betrayal doesn't just wound the betrayed, it poisons the betrayer until they're choking on their own lies. Helen sent a message too softer, uncertain, as if testing which way the wind was blowing. She spoke of confusion, of sadness, of hoping things could be repaired. But nothing was broken by me. It was broken by Daniel the moment he chose greed over love, exclusion over honesty. I let her words sit unanswered. Sometimes silence is the only language that toxic family understands. Meanwhile, Daniel grew louder. Angry texts filled my phone, accusations, threats, promises of lawsuits. I saved them all, each one another nail in the coffin of his credibility. He didn't realize that every outburst, every written threat, every desperate plea was more evidence of his guilt. This was no longer just a vacation gone wrong. This was an inheritance drama, a revenge story playing out in real-time, proof that karma doesn't need theatrics to deliver its blow. It just needs truth. Through it all, I felt Eleanor's presence more than ever. Her words echoed with each decision I made. Kindness is not weakness. She had been right. For years I had confused generosity with duty, love with obligation. Now I knew the difference. I could still be kind, still be loving, but not to those who weaponized it against me. My kindness would go to places where it mattered, to children who needed scholarships, to veterans who needed care, to seniors who needed companionship. My love would no longer be currency for Daniel to spend. The public humiliation was his to carry now. Neighbors whispered, colleagues questioned, even Clara's parents looked at him differently. He had been exposed not just to me, but to everyone who mattered in his life, and he had done it to himself. Justice had been served not in a courtroom, but in the simple act of truth unveiled. I sat one evening in my favorite chair by the window, watching the sun sink behind the Oakland hills, the sky painted in gold and crimson. My phone buzzed on the side table, Daniel's name lighting up the screen again. I let it ring. Some lessons can't be taught with words. Some lessons are only learned when silence answers betrayal. I sipped my tea, steady hands lifting the cup. steady heart beating in my chest. The man they thought they could discard had returned stronger, clearer, untouchable. And as darkness fell, I whispered to myself and to Eleanor's memory, family betrayal always has a price, and I've finally collected what was owed. After the confrontation at the airport and the storm of phone calls that followed, something surprising happened inside me. I didn't feel the hunger for more revenge. The anger that had burned so hot in those first days began to cool, not because the betrayal hurt any less, but because the justice had already been served. Daniel had been exposed, Clara's excuses had fallen flat, and the mask my family wore was gone forever. There was nothing left to chase. I didn't need to twist the knife. The truth itself had been enough. For the first time in months, my days slipped into a quiet rhythm again. Morning coffee, brewed in the old percolator, the smell filling the kitchen, just like it used to when Eleanor was alive. I sat at her oak desk, the one where she wrote letters to neighbors, and kept meticulous notes about community projects, and I realized that even in death she was still guiding me. She had always believed in giving to those who truly needed it, not to those who demanded it. Kindness is not weakness. Her voice lived in those words, and now it was my turn to prove them right. I began drafting a plan not for Daniel or Clara, not for Helen or Robert, but for the future of people I would never meet. I opened my portfolio and looked at the balance sheets Richard had prepared. The numbers stared back at me, decades of careful saving and investing retirement accounts. Stocks, real estate, equity, more than enough to change lives if placed in the right hands. Why let betrayal define this money when it could become a legacy of hope? I contacted Richard again and asked him to expand the will we had drawn up. I want specific allocations, I told him. Scholarship funds for underprivileged kids in Oakland, a donation to the Veterans Center Eleanor used to volunteer at, endowments for senior services and community development programs. Richard nodded his pen, scratching across his legal pad. Henry, this is exactly what estate planning should be. You're turning pain into purpose. And that's when it struck me, I wasn't just cutting Daniel out. I was cutting out the rot of entitlement, the toxic cycle of dependency that had poisoned my family for years. Instead of fueling more greed, my estate would fund opportunities. A violin in the hands of a child who couldn't afford lessons, a scholarship for a first-generation college student, a hot meal for a senior forgotten by their children. Each act of giving would be a rejection of the toxic family betrayal that had nearly broken me. This wasn't revenge anymore. This was reconciliation, not with Daniel, but with myself, with Eleanor, with the values we had once built our lives on. Of course, the calls continued. Clara begged, Helen pleaded, Daniel threatened. Dad, you'll regret this, he said in one voicemail, his voice tight with fury. But regret is for mistakes. This was no mistake. Each message only confirmed that I had chosen the right path. I didn't answer them. I didn't need to. My silence spoke louder than anything I could have said. In that silence, I discovered peace. I walked the neighborhood trails again, the ones Eleanor and I used to stroll hand in hand. I stopped by the community garden and donated tools in her name. One afternoon, I visited the local high school and spoke with the principal about funding a scholarship for engineering students. His eyes lit up as he explained how many kids dreamed of college but couldn't afford it. I left the meeting lighter than I had felt in years. That's what real legacy feels like, not money spent on ungrateful children, but opportunities planted in the lives of strangers who will never know my name, only the doors that quietly open for them. Family betrayal had once left me hollow. Now it was filling me with something greater than revenge purpose. I began to sleep deeply again. No nightmares of airports, no echo of Daniel's voice telling me to just go home. Instead, I dreamed of Eleanor smiling, her hands resting gently on my shoulders, her eyes proud. I dreamed of classrooms filled with students of seniors, sharing meals of children, laughing in playgrounds built with community grants. That was the future my money would build. That was the story I would leave behind. And in that way, I found reconciliation. Not with Daniel, not with Clara, not with the family who had chosen betrayal over love, but with myself, with Eleanor, with the truth that kindness is strength when it's directed wisely. So when people ask me what happened after the inheritance drama, after the revenge story that went viral in whispers of toxic family and betrayal, I tell them this justice was served, but peace was earned. And peace is the sweetest form of victory. The house in the Oakland Hills was quiet that evening. the kind of quiet that doesn't ache anymore, but soothes. I sat in my favorite chair by the window, a cup of tea cooling slowly in my hands, and watched the last light of day spill across the garden Eleanor once tended with such care. The air smelled faintly of roses and earth, the same way it did when she was alive. And for the first time in years, I felt at peace. The phone lay dark on the side table, silenced long ago. Its unanswered calls, a reminder that some conversations no longer belong to me. I didn't need to hear Daniel's anger or Clara's apologies. Their voices had been replaced by something stronger, the sound of my own heartbeat, steady my own mind clear. The man they thought they could erase had not only survived, he had won. I thought back to the airport, the chaos of voices, the tearing open of that envelope, the truth laid bare for all to see. And then I thought about tonight, about this silence, about the certainty in my chest. Family betrayal always has a price. Daniel learned it in public humiliation, and I learned it in the strength of reclaiming myself. Eleanor's words still anchor me. Kindness is not weakness. I carry them forward not as a wound, but as a weapon of peace, a promise that my legacy will not be measured in what was taken from me, but in what I chose to give. Scholarships, community programs, lives touched by quiet generosity. That is how betrayal ends and justice begins. To those listening now, I'll say this: we all carry scars, and sometimes the deepest ones are carved by those we trusted most. But scars can remind us not of weakness, but of survival. If you've ever felt discarded, underestimated, or betrayed, know this: you are not powerless. Justice in its many forms always finds its way. And now I leave you with a choice. If this story stirred something in you, if you've ever faced a toxic family moment, share your thoughts in the comments below. Let your voice be heard. Save this video if you need the reminder that betrayal is never the end of the story. And subscribe because more stories of resilience, justice, and redemption are waiting to be told. In the end, betrayal is not what defines us. What defines us is how we rise after it.